In this talk, I'm going to present a computational model of human vocal learning. It is a mystery how infants learn to speak. Can infants learn by watching other people talk? It seems unlikely because most of the articulators are hidden. Then, can infants learn by instructions from the caregivers? It also seems unlikely because then the instructions are incomprehensible and generally the caregivers do not know how to teach children. The most reliable way of learning is through listening because acoustic input is guaranteed. It is also noting that congenitally blind children can still learn to speak, but congenitally deaf children cannot learn to speak without special training. However, the auditory information that an infant have access to is not straightforward. One important factor that makes the learning difficult is the huge anatomical differences. And the three plots shows the relative size of an adult male, female, and an infant vocal tract model, respectively. Due to the anatomical differences, their acoustic signals are also very different. On the left-hand side, it shows the vowel space of a male from childhood to adulthood, and the right-hand side shows a female version. As we can see that F1 and F2 differs greatly when the age changes. So it remains unclear how the learning is achieved given the anatomical differences. It is known as the speaker normalization or the correspondence problem. And it is difficult to identify the exact underlying mechanisms from observation or neural study alone. So then, what if there is a predictive computational model that can simulate the step-by-step progression of vocal learning? So that's our motivation. And actually, there have been many attempts to tackle the problem of how children learn to speak by computational modeling. And some of the models are neurobiologically motivated models. And the rest of the listed models are all focusing on simulating the learning mechanisms. And here are some examples of the previous models. DIVA model is one of the earliest models that deals with the simulation of speech acquisition. It is a neural network-based model that simulates the sensory motor interactions during speech acquisition. And the model actually learned intelligible vowels, but the consonants were not clear. So here are some examples. And other researchers have tried to solve the speaker normalization problem by the assistance from a mature speaker. The simulation of caregiver-infant interaction has attracted a lot of attention. And in this learning paradigm, the caregiver selectively reinforces the baby's speech, and then the baby gradually develops an inventory of motor patterns that corresponds to speech sounds. For example,
bunny.
And then the infant recognizes sound.
Nu.
And then the baby produces output.
Bunny.
So the process repeats, and then here are one of the examples of the learning outcome. Oops, sorry. I can't locate the sound anymore for some reason.
new,
Okay, so in general, the model also learned some vowels, but again, the consonants were less successful. And the latest vocal learning model was proposed by Philipson. She started with models of acoustic imitation, but then she recently moved on to go babbling. So the model has a go space, which is also a auditory space. And then the model was trained to learn vowels and CV sequences. And here are some examples.
Ha, ba, ma.
So they also have other examples of different vowels, but it is worth noting that the study only generated two CV sequences, which is ma and ba. So we don't know how it will perform when learning different consonants and different vowels. The aim of our study is actually to generate intelligible words with CV syllables, because previous models has encountered difficulties in generating CV co-articulation. So our method contains three main components. The first one is modeling of co-articulatory dynamics with high-dimensional vocal tract models. And second one is that we use acoustic features to simulate language universal perception that detects phonetic differences in all languages. And we used a deep learning-based speech recognizer to simulate language-specific perception that captures the key phonetic properties that distinguish words in a language. And we are also among the first to use listening experiments for the evaluation of the model. Here is an overview of our model. So it starts with vocal exploration of an adult and child vocal tract models. And then it generates context-sensitive articulatory kinematics of consonants and vowels that resulted in the co-articulation. And then these articulatory kinematics will be passed to synthesize speech. And this would be the motor control model in our simulation. After the speech is synthesized, it will be passed to the sensory system. So we simulated two types of auditory feedback as introduced before, MFCCs, and also a speech recognizer. And at the meantime, we included somatosensory feedback, which indicate whether a vocal tract is open or closed. So this is provided by Vocal Tract Lab in the motor system. So the model tries to learn different articulatory parameters guided by the sensory feedbacks provided by the sensory system. And we used Vocal Tract Lab as a speech synthesizer. It is controlled by 17 articulatory parameters as introduced before. What's special about our motor control model is that we simulated co-articulation explicitly by the synchronized dimension-specific target approximation model. In this model, consonants and vowels are fully synchronized at the syllable onset. And despite the overlap, the articulation is sequential along specific articulator dimensions. And if we take velar stop vowel sequence, for example, in this case, the tongue body can be controlled by the consonant to achieve a velar closure, while the other tongue parameters can be controlled by the vowel for achieving an appropriate vowel articulation. After the kinematics are calculated, then it will generate the speech. And here are another highlighting point of our model, that it is the deep learning based speech recognizer model. Here is an illustration of the architecture. It contains three main parts. The first convolutional layer in blue was designed to learn the feature representations that correlate in spatial and temporal domains. And then the classification module in green was used to learn the temporal dependencies of the features. And lastly, the classification module in red was used to learn the relationship between the features for classifying the phonemes. And then the trained speech recognizer retains phoneme scores. The optimization was done by simulated annealing. The model discovers the articulatory targets guided by the acoustic features or the speech recognizer. So as in terms of acoustic error, it was calculated by the Euclidean distance between the MFCCs of the target and the synthetic speech. And then the recognition error was calculated by the Euclidean distance between the target vector and then the recognized vector of the synthetic speech. And here are the target words. So these are minimal pairs for CVC words. And then we use the learned vocal tract parameters to resynthesize a few CVCV words. Here is a demonstration video of the learning process guided by the speech recognizer. It starts with vocal exploration. And then here are the results.
Bad.
Bad. Bad. Bad. Bad.
Bad. Bad. Bad. Bad.
Bad. Bad. That. That. Did. 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 Good. Good. Body. Body.
Nabby. Nabby.
But. 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 Bet. Bet. That. That. Cut. Cut. Body. Body. Daddy. Daddy.
After we train the models, we use listening experiments to evaluate the results. So we conducted two types of listening experiments. One is to ask them to write down what they heard, which is a free dictation experiment. The other one is to ask them to choose from a word list. Then that is a multiple choice experiment. And we recruited participants for different experiments, and there are 120 participants in total. So here are the results. The plot here shows the waveforms and spectrograms of the natural and synthetic speech. The natural female speech is in red, and the synthetic one is in blue. In the dictation experiment, the mean phonic accuracy was 76% for the adult synthetic speech, and then 95% for the natural speech. But as we can see in the histogram, that some of the speakers can still able to identify the synthetic speech with accuracy close to natural speech. And then the model learned more intelligible onset and coda consonants compared with vowels. As to the CV words, the mean phonic accuracy was 96% for the synthetic one and 97% for the natural one, which is almost identical. And this shows that the learned articulatory parameters can be generalized to novel words. The plot here shows the learned articulatory kinematics. The model learned varied consonant configurations depending on the vowel context. And take the bilabial stops, for example, it was articulated with closed lips in both instances, but the tongue shape was different at the consonant closure. It is already leaning towards the vowel target. Having successfully simulated learning of intelligible words, now we can evaluate the influencing factors. We compared the effectiveness of two types of auditory feedback, which is acoustics and recognizer. We find that the words learned by the speech recognizer was more intelligible than those ones trained by acoustic features. The recognizer one is in red and the acoustics one is in blue. We also find that it is more intelligible for the words trained by the recognizer, regardless of the age of the model, and also regardless of the listening experiment that we used. What's more interesting is that we find no correlation between human accuracy and the acoustic error, but there is a significant negative correlation between human accuracy and the recognizer error. So we can now know that the speech recognizer is more beneficial in training the speech acquisition than acoustic features. We also find that the somatosensory feedback has further facilitated the learning of the articulatory targets. And we also compared the learning results of vocal tract models of different ages. We can see that the adult model learned more intelligible speech than the child models. So the accuracy is higher in the adult models, and the 3-year-old boys model is slightly better than the 1-year-old model in the listening experiments. And it is the same tendency in the two types of experiments. Our recognition error also shows that the adult model learned speech with very low recognition error, while the child ones learned with quite high errors in some cases. And we also see that the CVCV words had higher intelligibility than CVC words. And also, again, the age of the model significantly influenced the learning results. And here is a summary of our results. We have demonstrated that the perception-guided vocal learning is achievable, and language-specific perception is the key to vocal learning. We also find that it is essential that the articulatory dynamics are simulated realistically. We have also found age-related anatomical differences that affects learning. We have built an effective model that can simulate vocal exploration at different ages with a capacity to synthesize highly intelligible speech. And we find that the speaker normalization problem can be resolved with appropriate auditory representations, that is, the recognition of speech units in our experiment, simulated by the speech recognizer. And it is far more efficient than the acoustic features, which basically reflects the auditory processing that detects all the phonetic properties, regardless of whether it is important for distinguishing meanings or not. And we have shown that production and perception can be linked by self-learning, despite the anatomical differences. And it is also worth noting that we didn't make use of any corrective feedback, and we are not using any help from the caregivers. So it is generally a self-learning process. Our computational approach has opened a new path towards examining the cognitive mechanisms behind vocal learning, speech perception, and production. So there is still a fruitful area for further modeling work to explore how speech production can be recruited for the sake of speech perception, and how speech motor movements are adjusted when auditory feedback or somatosensory feedback are altered. And also, we are interested in how visual feedback will change learning, and which will be presented later by Paul. So that's all from me.